them or alter them in some way, or carefully cut out a row of cilia and put it in backwards. You can do all sorts of really not very respectful things to these little organisms, and they would heal very quickly, and then that defect was just reproduced indefinitely. The next generation would be produced with exactly the same defect. Even though you could show genetically that the DNA, the genes, the genetics had not been changed one iota. It's exactly the same as before. And yet this structure was inherited indefinitely. I've said it. You could do all sorts of surgical alterations and they were inherited indefinitely. Now, first, of course, many dismissed this as a quirk of these peculiar one-celled creatures with their elaborate cell surface structures. And so these are the kind of statements you've got. An extreme departure from our standard genetic system. I think that was Levantin said that. It's a rare example. It's bizarre. It's a lunatic fringe of biology. The only significant threat to our views, that was John Maynard Smith who said that. So, leading biologists were well aware of this evidence, but dismissed it, this is just a unique thing to do with ciliates. Because, they've got this elaborate cell surface structure, and when they reproduce, each cell in some way copies onto the new one. So the structure somehow forms some kind of template that copies onto the new one. Or at least that's what was thought to happen. Until it was found, I was jumping ahead. I'll go through it in order I've got here. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming that this couldn't be the case, that this must be universal, because that ciliate cord is an elaboration of the cell membrane and cytoskeleton, but a universal feature of animal and plant cells. All cells have the structures which are at the root of this particular elaboration. And the way in which cells develop are exactly the same in unicellular and multicellular organisms. There isn't any difference. The same processes happen exactly. So you wouldn't expect them to be different. And then this is the key evidence. They then found that some ciliates form cysts. One example, their pond dries up. And when they form a cyst, all visible cell surface structures disappear. In fact, you can, cut them in half and look at them under an electron microscope, and there is no structures to be seen. They look exactly the same as any normal animal cell, just a cell membrane. And no other structures visible at all. Everything has disappeared, dissolved. And yet, the cortical inheritance still occurs. If they had a defect, a surgical defect that had been produced in the cell surface structure before they form a cyst, then after they form the cyst and come out of it again, they form a new cell with that same defect as before. So however that cell surface structure is coded, it's not coded in visible structure. It also is coded somehow at a molecular level, to not even be visible in electron microscope photographs. So there is clearly another system of heredity operating in cells. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence for a wide variety of animals and plants that such a system is there, exists and operates, and in fact is responsible for the main features of the body plan, not the genes. So, as I say, those definitive papers were produced back in the 1950s. So we've known since then that the genetic paradigm is false, that there is more to heredity than DNA. And yet stubbornly, biologists carry on. So that wasn't the case. An historian of science has written a history of the whole affair. In fact, it was his PhD thesis, which was written, he did the research in the 1980s and produced a book about it all in 1987. And in 1987, he concluded this: throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the evolutionary significance of cortical inheritance was largely ignored by Darwinian evolutionists. Indeed, for the most part, it still is. And in 2005, he wrote, after 20 years, it is still ignored and not answered. Fascinating. And incidentally, I mean, it should be pretty obvious anyway that DNA can't be responsible for heredity. Because just think about it logically for a moment. DNA reductionism is like saying that the bumps on a CD, all right, the bumps on a CD are just like the bases in the DNA chain, create both the music and the CD player. The bumps on the CD are responsible for coding, creating the music and the CD player. Is that true? Of course not. Those bumps on the CD mean nothing without the CD player to recognize them and translate them through all its mechanisms into the music and speech that you hear. So obviously DNA encodes the building materials, but not the architect's plans. Heredity and development never start with DNA, they always start with whole cells. They never start with the bumps on the CD, you always start with the CD player and the CD. I was going to say, so what happens if you fiddle with the DNA of an organism? Well, let's take it as a chimp. If you fiddle with a chimp's DNA, we know from the times which has been done, you only get 3 possible outcomes. Another variety of normal chimp, an abnormal chimp that's not going to survive, or a dead chimp. There's nothing else you get by fiddling with DNA. And so I'm afraid, Jurassic Park films, that is just sheer nonsense. If you try to put dinosaur DNA, even if you could get it, which you can't, if you take dinosaur DNA and put it into a chicken egg or something like that, all you will ever get is some variety of chicken. You will not get some variety of dinosaur because the DNA does not give the essential information about dinosaurs. That comes from the egg. If it's a chicken egg, you will get a variety of chicken or nothing. So, interesting question I always pose at this point. Is there a scientific theory of evolution? Because we don't yet have a scientific theory of development. We don't know how a chicken develops into an egg. Because all we have, the only thing scientists are working on is the DNA story. But the DNA story only tells you how you go from DNA to a bag of chemicals, all the proteins and everything else that the DNA codes for. All right, so here's this bag of chemicals, which is from a cat. This one from a dog. That one from a horse, chimp, human. How does each of those bags of chemicals become those very, very different kinds of organism? We don't know. We haven't a clue. There is no theory of development in biology. Sorry, but there isn't.
I don't think so, Mr. Dawson. RNA plays a role in breakthrough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the picture at the DNA RNA level is getting more and more complicated all the time. And of course, I'm not saying that DNA and RNA do not have an essentially replaceable role to play in development. The only point I'm making here, there is more to heredity than the DNA RNA world, complex as it is. And as long as you leave out that other factor, you can't have a proper theory of development because you're leaving part of the picture out. And if you haven't got that theory of development, scientific theory of development, then of course you can't possibly have a scientific theory of evolution. There is no such thing as any scientific theory of origins yet in existence because we do not yet know enough about organisms. Until we know more about organisms, it's not possible to put forward a proper scientific theory. We're still at what Thomas Kuhn would call the pre-paradigm stage in our research and development. Now, that's not to say, let me just put one final point, then over to you. I'm not suggesting that there won't be a theory of development. Now, I don't believe that there's some mystery here that we're never going to solve. As soon as we start putting on the right spectacles and look for the right kind of evidence, I'm quite sure we'll start to come up with some real scientific theories of development. But they won't be reductionist DNA theories. All right, as I said, I told you at the beginning this was going to be a bit of a rambling evening. I wasn't really going anywhere in particular. I wanted to infuse you with these tropical fish and cichlids. I wanted to give you an insight into the way in which